The Gen 1 conference brings together students, staff, and faculty members, both who identify as FGLI and those who do not, to a unifying platform with the purpose of initiating dialogue. To paraphrase the words of a fellow UBC student, if we want to really be honest, this is about trying to make campuses more accessible to people inclusively. If you are somebody who's going to wear your poverty, that means you're taking the risk of being seen as not deserving to be here. The Gen 1 conference is the first steps of many steps that we must take to pave the way for FGLI students to feel accepted and at home in university. Now, as an FGLI student from Tanzania, one of my fondest memories growing up was when my entire family would come together for dinner. Every family would work, even the children, and so we wouldn't really see much of each other until the end of the day. We would gather together at the table to break bread, talk about everything from politics to science and the economy. That picture of home, the memory of our dinner table conversations, and the feeling of acceptance despite our differing views is what I want you to take away. Today, this conference will serve as all of our dinner tables, where we can bring up complex conversations in a safe, non-stigmatizing space to discuss the FGLI identity and its significance in Canadian higher education. With that in mind, I would like to invite everyone to engage in dialogue, to network, and to ask the hard questions in our workshops. We have categorized our workshops into 3 streams: inclusion, impact, and justice. We are hopeful that these streams will help rewrite the narrative from the destigmatization of the identity to a celebration of our students and our community. I would be remiss if I didn't thank the 15 FGLI students of color who have stood by me and worked really hard the past 8 months to bring this conference to life. Additionally, to our funders at UBC and our community partners, we would not be here without you and your confidence and support. To end, I would like to share a special thanks to the Ministry of Education in British Columbia, who has been very supportive of our conference. And with that, I would like to introduce our very first keynote speaker, Minister Jennifer Whiteside, who has dedicated her career to advocating for accessible post-secondary education. Minister Whiteside.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And Zara, wow, those were very, very powerful words. Thank you very much for your very powerful opening. I'm just going to get my notes up on the screen here so I can see. I am very pleased to be here today. I am coming to you today from my home constituency in New Westminster, the traditional territory of the Kakite Nation and the Coast Salish peoples. And it's a real pleasure to be here because I share a really deep commitment to education. And I was the first in my family to go to university and earn a degree. I grew up in a working class household, and when I think back to growing up, I remember my mother's stories about when she had to leave school at 16 to go to work. And she always really regretted not being able to finish high school. And I know that actually kind of haunted her. And so she did finally, when she was an adult, earn her high school equivalency, and achieved her lifelong dream of going to university after she retired. And my mom earned a Bachelor of Arts at SFU when she was 75. And she was the first person in her family to go to university and earn a degree as well. And certainly as part of a very rare cohort of people who engage in that endeavor at that stage of their life. So from an early age, education has really played a pivotal role in my life. And I really believe that education is a lifelong journey, that we never stop learning. Um, when I think about my educational journey, it's been enriched and supported by mentoring from teachers, from principals, vice principals, professors, everyone who's sort of encouraged me. But I also want to say that I think the kind of solidarity that you are all engaged in today, this is a profound act of solidarity that you are engaged in today. And I spent many years of my life through college and university in the student movement, advocating for post-secondary education, for accessible quality public education. And I learned a lot from the student movement. And I participated in many, I mean, there wasn't a first generation student union when I was at SFU. But I know that there were many students who would have benefited from this very focused experience that you're going to have today. So I think it's a very profound step and a very important expression of solidarity that you're taking today, and I really salute you for it. As the Minister of Education and a proud British Columbian, I strongly believe, of course, that education it's a cornerstone of a strong and equitable society, and it is fundamental to a thriving democracy. Education not only feeds our minds and spirits, but it broadens our horizons, serves as the foundation for us as we strive for a successful life and to build successful communities, I'd say as well. And you really are trailblazers here today. You carry such important hopes and dreams with you on your educational journey. And I appreciate the way that you've themed this conference, that you're paving the way, because I think that paving the way is very much sort of a mind set and a view of how we view life. In terms of how we can help support each other in our communities every single day. And so this is a terrific platform to bring together people to discuss all the important issues that are really critical to student success, ones that you've identified: food insecurity, financial and mental well-being, academic success. And I was noting the themes of your work, your workshops. Justice is very important. So you will be collective in this process today of collectively addressing barriers faced by first generation and low income students. And I think the discussions that you engage in today can foster real change, can break down those barriers, create pathways for greater inclusion and student success. As always, our thoughts and our actions need to reflect our values. And our values need to ensure that we put children and youth, students, families, and our communities first. So from paving the way for inclusion, to paving the way for impact, to paving the way for justice, the topics and discussions today, you will share, you will listen, you will learn, you will reflect, and I have no doubt that you will commit to action coming out of this conference as well. And I think you will find that it will support you. It will help you develop confidence and allow you to engage in the work that you're doing, in the community building you're doing, in your academic and in your academic goals as well. I think it's something many of us have experienced, that post-secondary education is not equally accessible for all students. And for some, graduating from secondary and moving on to post-secondary studies is sort of, seen as a natural evolution in their life and is expected. And some students face fewer barriers than others. And for those who haven't experienced the kinds of barriers that many of you have faced, they may not be aware of what those challenges are. And I think as you are unpacking those barriers today and looking for ideas and solutions and paving the way, part of what you will inevitably have to do is educate other students and policymakers about the particular challenges and barriers that you face and the solutions that you are going to put forward to how to address those. I mean, we all know the fundamental importance of quality education is that it levels the playing field and it provides opportunities, generational opportunities. So how do we make change to create equitable opportunities for people to move forward in school and in life? And I want to talk a bit about one of, some of your key themes, because it really starts with an overall commitment to equality and inclusion. And that is a collective commitment we have to make to each other. And that has to flow from our governments, our communities, our families. When I have to say too, I mean, it is a tremendous honor to have been asked to serve as the Minister of Education. And when I was asked to do that work and appointed to do that work in November, I received a mandate letter, as all ministers do. We are set out with a set of goals and objectives by the Premier. And I was very pleased to receive this particular set of goals and objectives, because among the key priorities are issues related to equity and inclusion. And in fact, those principles and that work is really at the foundation of everything that our government is doing. Our province's history and identity and strength really are rooted in its diverse population. Yet people from communities that have been made communities that have been made vulnerable by their social conditions, face historic and present day barriers that limit their full participation in their communities, in their workplaces, in society, and which place limitations on their lives. As the Minister of Education, I am committed to integrating the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion into the fabric of our education system. We have a moral and an ethical responsibility to tackle systemic discrimination in all its forms, to ensure equality, equity, and inclusion, that those are the foundational pillars in our decision-making. And really, in that sense, we will all benefit from your efforts today. And I'm very excited about the impactful work that you're going to be doing. Here's what we know. As students progress through the education system, they may encounter barriers and challenges that can be seen and most often addressed, but there are also those barriers and challenges that people don't see. Many don't realize that, and I'm speaking here mostly of our K-12 system, although I know this absolutely applies in post-secondary as well. But in K-12, schools are places where some children actually arrive hungry. In our province, in this country, kids come to school hungry. And at school, they receive meals and snacks and sometimes clothing. And food is sometimes provided to students out of pocket by teachers and staff and administrators. And often we have food and meal programs organized by school districts and community groups. And this is an important point because we know that well-fed children have longer attention spans, they can concentrate on the tasks at hand, and that they're ready to learn. And in fact, one of my priorities as Minister of Education is to create more and locally sourced school meal programs by working with Minister Lana Popham, our Minister of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries. And I would say that, providing food can be seen as a sort of a small step, but it's a critical step to lead young students to the opportunities of a post-secondary education and eventually a career that they are passionate about. And I will add that I view it as an equity supporting initiative as well. When it comes to supporting students now more than ever, we also really need to prioritize the health, mental health and well-being of children and staff in our education system. Mental health has really come to the forefront of our discussions and our work in schools and businesses, governments, communities, really across all sectors. And we know that early prevention is key with mental health. Destigmatizing mental wellness is so important so that people can reach out when they're struggling and they know, for example, that depression is an illness and needs care and attention and that there is help available. I know there are a lot of young people who have expressed stress and anxiety in their day-to-day lives, and that this has just been made much more acute as a result of the pandemic. And we know that the experiences that the generation of children going through this pandemic, the experience that they're living today will have a lasting impact on this generation. Our province's new mental health in school strategy embeds mental health and substance use programs and services for students throughout our education system. And this strategy expands on A Pathway to Hope, our government-wide strategy to transform mental health and substance use care for children and young people. And we are going to continue to invest in mental health supports for students and school staff so that everyone involved in a student's learning gets the help that they need. Students with mental health needs, youth in care, and those living in low-income families will benefit from $23 million in new supplemental supports this year. But of course, there is always room to do more. And that's why we're working to get dedicated youth and mental health teams up and running as soon as possible so students and school districts have more resources available. We know that when students have more access to meals, to mental health supports, they have better opportunities and a better foundation to learn and succeed. I believe this deeply, that every student in BC deserves the opportunity to transition to post-secondary studies if that's what they would like to do. And it is really vital that we prepare students for this next phase of their life. And so we need to continue to look at how we can provide opportunities for students to make that seamless transition to post-secondary. And one of the ways that we're preparing students is through a focus on skills training. Skills training encompasses career and trades courses and programs, offers students the best opportunity to get hands-on work experience in real-world settings. And both education ministries in BC are working together through the Student Transitions Project. And this is a partnership between the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Advanced Education Skills and Training, and it analyzes sort of data and information to see where and how improvements can be made to support student transitions. Ensuring that students are well prepared and supported as they move through from secondary school to post-secondary studies can have a positive domino effect for students throughout their lives. I want to say that, I think, and you're demonstrating this here today, all of our work requires collaboration. And I think what we have really learned through the pandemic is that we are in fact stronger when we pull together as a community. And if we come together like you are today, we can work to generate solutions to the challenges that we face. The lessons that we learn today will help shape generations to come. And you are examples. You carry those hopes and dreams with you. You are also examples of resiliency, of unity, and hopefulness. And ultimately, our commitments to equality and conclusion will depend on all of the strong and respectful relationships that we develop, that you develop here today, and that we develop in our communities. So I really want to just bring you hearty congratulations on pursuing your own academic goals, for paving the way for others, for your commitment to equity and to justice. And I want to encourage you to continue to be brave and bold. You are indeed breaking ground today, and it is such important ground to break. And you are indeed paving the way forward. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you today. I wish you an excellent, excellent conference.
Thank you so much, Minister Whiteside, for sharing your message and for your continued commitment to supporting students, especially those who might identify as first generation and low income. Our next keynote speaker has served as an educator and administrator for over 20 years and is the co-chair of the Indigenous Education and Reconciliation Council at the Simon Fraser University. It is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Caroline Roberts.
Squal Tinoyap, Carolyn Roberts, Quinnens na, Tanach Tatela Squa Omish Okameach, Naquaqua Okameach, Shiaktin Okameach, Chin Quinman Tomi, My heart is so full and so thankful to be here today. It is an honor to be speaking with you in this conference and in this way of paving the way forward. And it's just, yeah, I'm excited to hear how it all unfolds and what are the things that are going to be coming from this. I was asked to be a part of your journey here this morning to give some kind of historical context to Indigenous students and their relation to school and schooling and how that affects Indigenous students within the school system, and then what equity and justice and all of that that the minister was talking about as well, how all that unfolds for us in these academic spaces. I I wasn't the first in my family to go to post-secondary school, but I was the first to get my master's, and I am the first PhD within our family as well. I'm a student, and I'm hopefully going to be a doctor soon one day after all the work that I'm doing. So my heart is with all of you today as your first generations through, and I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Can you see the PowerPoint? Excellent. Here we go. So I am speaking to you today from the ancestral, unsurrendered territories of the Kwantlen, the Katzie, and the Semiahmoo peoples, whose ancestors have been living upon these lands for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. They have nurtured this land and taken care of it in order for us to be here today, and I always hold my hands up in appreciation and gratitude for them for doing this for us. Colonization has forever changed the landscape of this land. It has also greatly harmed my ancestors, my elders, my community, my family, myself, my children, and all of the original caretakers of these territories. Because of this history of colonization, my role as an educator is critical to educate those around me of our colonial history and the colonial structures that we all live within. As land acknowledgements grow and change, the importance of moving away from passively acknowledging the lands and the peoples of these lands, we now have to be active participants in educating ourselves about our colonial history of this land and the colonial structures that we are all situated within. And it is now time to collectively take on this responsibility to not only decolonize ourselves, but also decolonize our practices within education and within all of the areas of our life that we're in. So again, my name is Carolyn Roberts. I'm a faculty lecturer in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University. I'm also the Indigenous Teaching Fellow, which is a role that helps support other faculty in their knowledge and understanding of the colonial history and how to decolonize their practices. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Indigenous Education and Reconciliation Council at SFU, and I'm also a current ETAP student, a PhD student. And I'm so thrilled to be here today. So as I speak with you today, I really like to ground myself in the work that we're going to be talking about and doing today. And these are some beautiful questions that Daniel Heath Justice has in his book called Why Indigenous Literature Matters. And I think that these are good questions to have to take with you throughout this conference today. Number one is, how do we learn to be human? What are our experiences, customs, traditions, and ceremony that define our humanity? How do we behave as good relatives? What are our relational rights and responsibilities to one another? And how do we become good ancestors? How do we create the kind of world and relationships that will nurture those who come after and give them cause to thank us rather than curse or grieve our destructive selfishness? And then how do we learn to live together? What are the social and intellectual structures, conventions, and considerations that reduce or manage conflict and encourage harmonious relationships across our varied categories of difference? So keep those in mind as you do your work together today. So I need to start off by saying that what I talk about is difficult. And with difficult conversation comes discomfort. And I encourage you to lean into that discomfort so that change can happen. So if there's discomfort while I'm speaking to you today, listen to what it's trying to tell you. Joanne Archibald always tells us to listen with our 3 ears, 2 on the side of our head, and the other is our heart. So lean into this discomfort and just sit and listen and feel what it means to you. And then we can talk and grow from that by listening. I think about this work like throwing a stone into a body of water, like the Indigenous author Leanne Simpson talks about within her work. The stone and the act of throwing represents both intent and action. The impact on the water is a result of that action. When the stone hits the water, there's this immediate dramatic impact that it hits, and then there's a sound, and then displacement happens. But long after that stone sinks to the bottom, there's still all these concentric waves and circles that displace all of the water after it. And it goes across these carried different realms throughout the water, and it creates some kind of synergy or something that has been attempted to be erased within that. So with that being said, we can't talk about what's happening today without context, without understanding how we got to where we are today and what's gotten us here. So I'm going to be talking about trauma of colonization and the genocide that has happened and continues to happen in this place that we call Canada here today. There are so many things that have built this place, and I like to refer to it as a 1,000-piece puzzle. And you need each one of those pieces to fully understand the impact of colonization. If I were to pick out just one of these tiny pieces, that would be residential school. There is 999 other things that have created where we are today. And residential schools is just one piece. It's a large piece, but it's still just one piece. So what I'd like to start with is a brief history lesson, right? So just some key points along the way. There's lots of others, and this is just really, really brief. The biggest impact on Indigenous people is the Indian Act, which was created in the late 1800s. That is still in effect today. I have a status card. My children have status cards. We are still numbered underneath the governmental system today. And the Indian Act was to dismantle our governing systems that were already in place within all of our Indigenous communities across this land since the beginning of time. Our communities were based in laws and governances that revolved around our matriarchs. And the way to dismantle our system was to take away any and all rights of Indigenous women that they had within our communities. Within the Indian Act, there were so many policies in place that push down and tie the hands of our women. And this is a critical piece of the act because the settler colonial eye is focused on dismantling our system from the inside out. And today, we have women and children that don't have status because it was taken away from them because they married non-Indigenous men. And then we have non-Indigenous women today and their children that have status because they married Indigenous men. And that's crazy. So this law was taken back. They fixed the law, but those people who got their status taken away still have to fight in the court of law to get their status back. And it takes years and years and years to do that. While we still have people who aren't Indigenous at all that have status. To me, is crazy. So the Indian Act also introduced residential schools as a way to remove our family ties, our community connections, and completely remove the Indian in the child. This was a way to assimilate our children into the colonial system, or what, like John A. Macdonald liked to say, was to kill the Indian in the child. The Indian Act also created reserves so that the government had control over where Indigenous people lived and would move Indigenous communities to where they saw was a place that was uninhabitable or not worth any money to them. Removing us from our traditional territories would hopefully remove our connection and our claim to these territories. And then they held us there. They promised us food and water and shelter and education. But the Indian agents that were in charge did not allow for this to happen in a good way. They withheld fruit from us. And we lived and still live in inhumane living conditions on reserves across Canada today. Some reservations have had boil water advisories in place for over 20 years. We can't even get clean drinking water to reserves because we were uprooted from where we lived to be put off into a place so that the settlers could have the land. And we are still suffering from that today. The Europeans also changed our names. The Indian agent would come into our communities. From one of my elders told me that he remembers that they got the whole family together and they said that the family was too big. They divided the family in half and they gave one family this name and this side of the family another name. So they wanted to disconnect our ties to each other, and they gave us European names rather than our own names, which is why you see on in nations today, nations with big last names that are all similar throughout different nations because they were given to us, not that we actually had them. They also restricted us from leaving these reserves. So they restricted our hunting and restricted our fishing and restricted our ability to gather food. So they held us captive in these places and they created a pass system so that if we wanted to leave the reserve and let's say I wanted to go visit my auntie out in Tsleil-Waututh, because I'm from Squamish, I would want to go there. I'd have to ask the Indian agent for permission. And the Indian agent would then give me a pass if I was allowed to go, give me a pass and then give me a date and a time where I had to be. If I was caught off reserve, not in the place where I said I'd be, I'd get thrown in jail. If I was off reserve without a pass, I'd get thrown in jail. So they totally controlled everything that we did. So even if they were withholding food from us and we wanted to go hunting or fishing, we couldn't because there was laws in place that forbid us to go hunting and fishing. And those laws are still in place today. And that's why you see the fisheries having such an impact on Indigenous people because it was a way to control us. And they also forbid us to be in groups larger than 3 people. This was a law that was in place because the government at the time thought that if we gathered in place that we would talk more and create political parties and political arguments on this mistreatment and the misleading of these laws in order to fight back. So if there was more than 3 Indigenous people together at one time, you would get thrown in jail. So we couldn't gather together, which made it really difficult when we wanted to celebrate our traditions, which is some of the other laws that I'd like to talk about, is the potlatch and the Sundance law. Now, Sundance is prairies out Alberta, Saskatchewan way, but potlatches are here. Potlatches are our ceremonies here on the coast. Our potlatches would celebrate weddings, funerals, babies, namings, and it was our governance system. It was a way that we could make sure that we were taking care of each other and those around us. We would have these gatherings and they would last for weeks and we would feed everybody and shelter everybody, and then we would give away our wealth because that's who we were and who we still are as Indigenous people. We don't take, we give. That's a part of our being of who we are. For 75 years, there was a law in place that forbid us to practice our culture, forbid the potlatch, which was our singing, our dancing, our regalias, and our languages. This was a law that made such a huge impact on us being able to still speak our languages today and our children to be able to speak their languages today. So if you were caught doing a potlatch, the RCMP and the Indian agent would come in and they would take all of your regalia and everything that was to do with the ceremony, and they would either take it out front and burn it in a huge pile, or you can see many of these stolen items from our communities all around the world in museums, especially the MOA has lots of them. My beautiful friend, Dr. Amy Parent from UBC, is right now working on getting her totem pole for her community repatriated back to the Nisga'a territory, because right now it's sitting in a museum in England where it was stolen and taken to. So this is a long process in order to get our cultural things back, and she's doing that work right now, and it takes a long time for that to happen. We were also denied the right to vote. When British Columbia became British Columbia, 90% of the population was Indigenous and 10% of the population was settlers. And settlers were the only ones who could vote. At one time, I want to say like the mid 1880s, the government actually gave Indigenous people the right to vote. And once we got the right to vote, then we started to vote out those who were creating these laws that held us down and took us, and that didn't allow us to do what we had to do. So then they changed the law that we could vote, and they changed it to only people who were civilized could vote. And being Indigenous, you were a savage and uncivilized. So we got the vote taken away from us, and then we weren't actually allowed to vote until 1961. It was also against the law for us to speak our languages. We couldn't communicate in it, and if you were caught doing that, then you were thrown in jail. And you would also be thrown in jail if you didn't send your children to residential schools. So the Indian agents knew within our communities who the children were, and they would come with the RCMP and take our children from our communities and take them to residential school. And if you didn't send your kids to residential school, you'd be thrown in jail, and they would take your kids anyways. The laws that were put in place not only tied our hands, but it silenced us as humans, as stomach, as humans. Today, if there was laws in place that were racist and unfair, you would hire a lawyer to fight against these laws, right? Because they're unfair, and you would have a case that this is actually a racist policy and we need to change it. So the government then put a law in place that Indigenous people couldn't hire lawyers. And if the lawyer did work for Indigenous people, that lawyer would lose their job. So what do you do if you can't hire a lawyer? Well, then you become a lawyer yourself. So back then, if I were to become a lawyer, an educator, I would lose my status. And losing my status means losing my claim to my territory, to my treaty rights, and to my land claim rights, and ties to my community. I'd be moved out of my community because I wouldn't be allowed to live there. So if I became a lawyer, then I would be enfranchised and moved into the colonial system. And then if I did take on the case, then I would lose my job. So then what do? Then you can't hire a lawyer. You can't become a lawyer. There's always friends around us that see the inequities and injustices. Then they would help you, and then they would try to hire a lawyer to be able to do this for you. But it was against the law for them to do that. And even if we could, they asked the Aboriginal minister, and the Aboriginal minister always had final say whether you could take an item to court or not. And there was no records anywhere that any items were ever taken to court about this. So then what do? Well, then you protest, right? Yeah, unfair, unjust laws in place. We need to protest and make change happen. But we were forbidden to gather in more than 3 people. And if you were gathering more than 3 people as Indigenous people, you'd get thrown in jail. So our hands are tied again. We can't use the system to fight back against the system because the system kept putting laws in place in order for that not to happen. So then what do you do if you can't protest? You go to war. But the government of Canada knew that the Indigenous people wouldn't go to war because they had their children. And if they went to war with them, they would never see their children again. So that brings us to residential schools. All of my sisters went to residential school. My birth mother and all of her siblings went to residential school. They went to St. Mary's Residential School. They're from Naquaqua, and for reference sake, that's up past Whistler, Pemberton, just past there. It takes about 4 hours from where I am. They were driven down to Squamish at the time, and then they had to take a boat from Squamish all the way to Horseshoe Bay, and then from Horseshoe Bay, they put them on a bus and took them to St. Mary's in Mission. This was about a 7-hour trip. The Indian agents would come into our communities and take all of our children. So once the children were gone, there was no children left in these communities. And all over BC, you can see these places where there's these abandoned villages. They're abandoned villages because they took our kids and we needed to be close to them. We needed to be somehow still connected to them. So my grandmother, who spoke 5 Indigenous languages of the territories up there, packed up and moved to Mission in order to be close to her children because they were taken from her. We were also forced to learn English and the religion of the school. So, as I said, my grandmother spoke 5 Indigenous languages of the territories. My birth mother speaks none. She speaks none of them because when she was at residential school, she was taught that Indigenous languages were bad and evil, and that she was a heathen and that she was a dirty Indian if she practiced cultural traditions and spoke those languages. So they cut the ties off to our heritage and our knowledge system within these languages because of being there in these schools. There's also children raped, abused, and tortured, and used as medical guinea pigs. There's evidence that many of the schools had, not many of them, but a few of the schools had electric chairs in order to combat their rules and regulations within the schools. There's also research that was done on what malnutrition does for students. In 1907, Dr. Bryce went across Canada to find out what was happening at these schools as part of the government to find out what was happening at these schools. He found that the children were we're not eating correctly. Sorry. They were also sick. And he put a report forward telling the government all of these things that were happening at these schools and that these students were not being taken care of in the correct manner. And then he was fired from his job. So they knew in 1907 what these schools were doing to our children, and nothing was done about it. The final residential school didn't close until 1996, 90 years later. They knew 90 years before that what was happening. Dr. Cindy Blackstock does the work today of Dr. Bryce. She continues to fight for justice and equality rights for Indigenous students, and her work is grounded in what Dr. Bryce has started. Half of the children that went to these schools died. So if the Indian agent came in and took your children, you didn't know if they were coming back, or you didn't know if all of them were coming back, because half the students died. And they say that there's 6,000 students that died, but I believe that list is a lot larger. St. Mary's alone found 3 mass graves of children and babies there. So there's far more than 6,000 children unaccounted for and passed away at these schools. And again, the last one closed in 1996. This was a huge factor and continues to be a huge factor of what Indigenous people are still struggling with today. When we're talking about intergenerational trauma, the trauma that these students and these children that went to these schools have now held on to and passed on to the next generation is huge. So we're trying to navigate, how do we navigate this intergenerational trauma and harm that has been done to us? Because of what happened, we don't have our languages. as much as we did. There was over 200 languages across Canada before settlers came, and now we're only at 65. And out of those 65 Indigenous languages, there's only supposed to be 3 that survive into the next generation. So there's lots of work being done trying to revitalize the language, but there's not a lot who still hold the knowledge and hold the language because of the laws that were in place and because of residential schools. So I understand that this is a lot to take in this moment. I would like to give you just a minute or two just to think and a pause before I move into the next step. Sorry, I realized the time, so I'm gonna I'm gonna keep going. But so this is a quote that I use a lot within my work. This is a quote from Michael Marker, who recently passed away. He was a UBC professor and a huge inspiration for my master's work. Indigenous students experience our education system as assimilation and nullification of their own identity. This really speaks to how the Indigenous history still impacts Indigenous people and students within our system. If you think about that brief history I just gave you, this is how our Indigenous students feel within our educational spaces. And then if you add on top of that, our educators that are out there within the system, a large majority of them have never been taught about the true history of this place. They have all been taught this one-sided history that this land was vacant and that Indigenous people just gave it up and that we are all disappearing. But menwa e te tichet, we are still here. Thinking about that and then wanting to create this nurturing, comforting spaces for our students within our academic classrooms, we need to acknowledge that we as a society have to change this narrative. We as educators need to do the work that our own education system did not provide for us. And it is now time to take on this responsibility to learn about the impacts of colonization. This is a term that I'm using a lot more in my academics, and as Indigenous students, we are surviving through this, and our survivance is what speaks back to the colonial narrative. So how do we make sure that our voices are heard? We have to understand that Indigenous students come from a broken system, that they don't feel like they can trust the education system. They don't feel like they are heard. Indigenous students may feel like they can't even talk about where they come from and how they feel, or even identify themselves as Indigenous because of the negative stereotyping of society. And some Indigenous students are embarrassed of their own culture and their own identity. Not only our students, but also the parents and the families, because of their experience at residential school and the intergenerational trauma that's been passed down. So how do we change this? It's all about relationships. We need to start to build relationships with these students, with their families, with the larger communities as well. Connections make bridges. So I like to use this quote: the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it is justice. You can't throw money at things. We need to understand what justice is. Justice for all students within our classrooms, our schools, and our societies. A way to change this conversation is to start thinking in terms like anti-racist. Instead of me not being a racist, I am an anti-racist. How can we challenge ourselves to do better? What I try to do is to ask myself if my actions or thoughts are racist, or if they could be experienced as racist by others, or if they could produce a racist outcome. This helps me in trying to understand other viewpoints and the impact that I have on others. Being an anti-racist isn't something that I achieve. It is a practice that I'm continuing to develop on a daily basis. And another great question to ask ourselves is, what did I do today that was anti-racist? For me, this shifts the focus from not just trying to do no harm, but trying to contribute towards justice and true equality. Part of this work is really taking a hard look on how we treat and see others within our system. These ideas of working continuously to keep racism in check and develop anti-racist practices is being able to understand the differences between equality and equity. So I'm going to use this picture. So if you look at the top corner, inequality is where somebody's able to get something and the other child's not able to get what they're getting. So what we try to do in our education system is try to put in a one size fits all model so that they both can get something. But that one size ladder doesn't equal that for that child. That child still can't get what they need. So equity is taking a good hard look at what it is that that child needs and giving them something different. That's what needs to be done. And justice, that's just taking everything all apart. So looking at the structure is key when we're trying to understand systemic racism. As we build these relationships with our students and family, we need to be mindful that racism is a structure of power, a structure that our education system and our government system and our social system is all built upon. What needs to be looked at critically here is the broader systemic issue that our system is built upon racist ideas and racist policies. So how do we start to change that? We change the way we view the system in place, and we need to start by identifying them, naming them, and using words that clearly state the racist policies that are in place. One of the main racist policies in place today within our education system is the equity gap. When talking about a racist system, we are talking about terms and frameworks. We're talking about this featureless objective numbers when we give numbers to successful graduation rates. And this is damage-driven data, which allows for the continuation for the Western colonial system to continue the systemic racism without us even actually realizing that it's still going on. We are speaking to Indigenous inferiority when we are starting negatively and reinforcing the racist beliefs that our children are less than others. Indigenous students and BIPOC students need to be talked about more than just a broken and conquered people. This is an incomplete story, and as Eve Tuck says, it's an act of aggression. Using academic achievement and graduation rates and dropout rates as the only method to measure success, this perpetuates the racial beliefs that our students are less than smart, less than brilliant, less than period. I'm just gonna, whoops. I know I'm running out of time. So to believe in this racial hierarchy is to believe in a racist idea. The hierarchy model that there's students at the top who are successful and graduate, and that there's students at the bottom who fail and don't graduate. This model that says that there's something wrong with the people at the bottom. That's what it's telling us. But if we look at it as an anti-racist, it's telling us something completely different. It says that there's something wrong with the system that is not allowing those students at the bottom to be successful. So we have to take a look at the system to find out what's missing within our system that's not letting these students be successful. For me as an Indigenous person, success for our next generation looks like our children being able to speak their ancestral languages, being able to be on the land and learn from their elders about hunting and carving and weaving, and learning about our territories, our stories, and our traditions. For us, Indigenous peoples, this would mean that our indigeneity would continue for the next 7 generations. But this kind of success is not recognized within the Western colonial system. So what's missing from our system for this to be successful? University classrooms are a difficult place for Indigenous and BIPOC students. The Western colonial narrative is upheld in many of these spaces. Many spaces reflect only whiteness and Western colonial ideas, which make these spaces complex and unwelcoming for Indigenous and BIPOC students. We as Indigenous students must constantly push back against the colonial narrative and navigate the colonial system, and also create space so our voice can be heard within classrooms. We must identify the oppressive forces and structures as well as navigate the system. The unwelcoming spaces of Western colonial system, they're difficult spaces for us to survive in as Indigenous and BIPOC students. It is the responsibility of the academy and the professors to not traumatize and re-traumatize our Indigenous and BIPOC students within our classrooms. So I'm here today as a survivor of the colonial education system. I am still surviving it today and constantly pushing back against the system. And I have hope that we are moving to a place of greater understanding. And my hope lies with all of you here today. You who are the first generation of your family to be here, you taking the step into the academy, you are brave, you are smart, and you carry that fire within you that will serve you well on this journey. And I'm not going to say that the journey is going to be easy and all fun and roses all the time. You're going to have ups and downs, but you are here, and that matters, and you matter. My advice to you is education plants these seeds in us to give us a new perspective, a new outlook that may shift your thinking and could possibly shift your whole entire life path. We will never know walking into these classes what the future holds for us, but we do know that taking that step and opening ourselves up to the possibilities will give us a new door to open, a new path to take, or a new journey that we may never even thought was possible because we didn't take that first step. But being open to possibilities, because it can change your life. You have the opportunity to change the world and make it better. And it's in your hands to make the difference. So I'm so proud of you for taking that first step. Hoichach, take good care.
Thank you so much, Ms. Roberts, for that inspiring and insightful speech. I would like to emphasize that all of our work as FGLI students is actually built on the foundations by those before us, especially by Indigenous and First Nations communities who have fought against the systemic, persistent, and historic discrimination that has limited the access to higher education. To continue having these conversations during workshops and throughout the day, we must all commit to unlearning biases that we have been exposed to in our lives. With that being said, we will now be transitioning into the conference orientation session, in which our planning committee will help you orient yourself to BRELA and also learn all of its features so that you're comfortable navigating between workshops. And so with that, I think I just want to just say thank you to all our attendees so far and our keynote speakers. A special thanks to Ms. Roberts as well as Ms. Whiteside. We'll be now moving into the conference orientation session, which will be headed by our technical advisors. And so we will focus on going into BRELA and getting the Zoom link for that, which will also be posted by my co-president in this chat.